Asia Tech Podcast with Graham Brown and Michael Waits.
Hello and welcome to Asia Tech Podcast Stories, where we share the most exciting, the most innovative stories in the Asian tech ecosystem. And if you ever ask my next guest today, are you free to catch up next Wednesday? You may find his personal assistant Evie step in and arrange that schedule with you. What you may not know is that Evie isn't a real person, but an AI-powered personal assistant. And it's pretty impressive too. I say it, maybe it's she, maybe she's pretty impressive too. You see, I'm an AI graduate, so I'm pretty aware of most AI-looking things, from chatbots to the Turing Test. But this is the first time I ever interacted with Evie. I thought she was a real person, so it's that good. So, to lift the lid on the life of his assistant, I'm joined today in the ATP Stories studio by Praveen Velu, co-founder of Evie.AI, to talk about AI and what he's learned building an AI-powered startup in Singapore. Praveen, welcome to the show.
Morning, Graham. It's good to be with you.
Excellent. The real man himself, powering the AI personal assistant. I think to start off with, talking about Evie, there's an interesting backstory, isn't there, with your original name for the company, because it helps people understand how this all sort of fits into context. Because you weren't called Evie originally, you were called Mimetic. So some people may have heard of you from that company name, but you eventually changed your name to Evie. So before we dive into Evie and find out what she is, and I'm interested to know how you refer to it in your company as well. Tell us a little bit about how you started off naming this Mimetic and why you changed that to Evie.
Yeah, so 2 years ago, my co-founder, a guy named Jin, and I, thinking maybe a little bit too ahead of our time, thought that we should probably differentiate the company from all the product lines that we were going to build eventually. So we spent a lot of time trying to come up with a kind of punchy company name, and finally we settled on Mimetic. The root word for mimetic is mimic, and we really wanted, and we still do, want to build products that, from an interaction standpoint, completely mimic how human beings communicate with each other, and should be indistinguishable from another human being. But 2 years down the line, I think that hasn't quite caught on. We've heard every pronunciation variation of the word mimetic now. And even when we go to conferences and they issue our passes, it usually has our name on it and our company, mimetic.ai. But then they also feel compelled to put Evie in brackets, because really everybody knows Evie. Mimetic was always a bit of a mouthful. So a couple of months ago, we decided, we're done with Mimetic, which is going to be Evie.ai.
Got it. So you're going to this conference, you have the lanyard with Mimetic on it, brackets Evie.ai, and somebody
No, just Evie.
Right, Evie now, okay. So somebody walks up to you and sees Evie. What's the typical kind of reaction when they clock that and they realize who that is and who you are?
Yeah, so 3 types of people. One, either is, they've never heard of us. The other is they're users, and then they start gushing on the spot about how Evie's kind of changed their lives, right, and changed the way they work. Or there's somebody else who's interacted with Evie and hadn't quite clocked that she's not a human being. Yeah, so then that always is a very good conversational starter. And we hear from our users about how the topic of Evie has become a bit of an icebreaker when they're meeting people for the first time. And we've heard stories about, users attending conferences or lunches, and, people have issued passes for Evie thinking that she's coming as well, or made an additional reservation for her. So we've had people walk into customer offices insisting that they're there to meet
Evie, right. Yeah. I want to speak to Evie. Oh, wow. Yeah. That's amazing. I mean, that's a really good sign. If we bring that back to the artificial intelligence side of things, for those, everybody knows AI now, but there's a sort of a marker in AI which was established many years ago, which is the Turing Test, which is, I mentioned earlier, which is, when people ask what actually is intelligence, there's so many different, definitions of what intelligence is. You can take a very philosophical approach. You can take a biological approach. So, people say, well, artificial intelligence, is this thing actually intelligent? It's maybe a bit of a philosophical discussion, but I guess it's important in the longer scheme, the longer view of things. But the Turing Test basically said, look, if this thing, this assistant, this program, this robot, whatever it is, appears to be intelligent or appears to, behave in a way that somebody thinks it's a human being, then it's intelligent. So the mark of intelligence is, does this thing actually behave in a way that a human being or any other kind of animal, if it was mimicking that, behaves? So it's very interesting that people actually think Evie is a real person. I don't know if the word fooling them is appropriate really here, right? But I'm just kind of curious about how you see it within your company. So let's talk about that. First of all, do you refer to Evie as an it, a she, or just curious? How do you call it in your company?
We refer to Evie as she.
Right.
She has become somewhat anthropomorphized. And, just as a term of endearment, we do refer to her almost as if she were a real person.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, that may be a small touch, but it may have a more profound impact as well longer term. How about how you think about these things, right? So let's talk about...
Yeah, no, I was going to say, you make an interesting point about intelligence, right? And is the mere ability to mimic human beings a sign of intelligence? Probably not. So if you take Evie, for example, she might set up a lunch appointment for you and me, but she really has no idea that what in the conventions of human beings is this thing called lunch, right? Other than the fact that it takes place across a certain time range from 12 o'clock to 2 o'clock every day, for example. So is that truly intelligence? Probably not. We don't think that artificial intelligence is anywhere close to what we're accustomed to when we talk about intelligence. And it's going to take a while to get to that point if ever we can.
Well, we go into the whole discussion about consciousness and all that area which we kind of open up, which really is beyond what we are able to program at this stage, right? Because the whole thing about, understanding that lunch is this thing, it's this kind of interaction and all the associations with it, and also to be aware of that. I mean, Evie's obviously not self-aware, or we don't know, obviously. So that's that whole exactly, that's the whole discussion. I mean, some people say that consciousness is this thing, which is, a very human thing. It's almost, not a spiritual thing, but at the same time, some people say, well, consciousness is just a byproduct of lots and lots of, processes going on in the brain. So anyway, that's a whole series of podcasts, and we won't go down that avenue. Let's talk about what Evie actually is. So if I was to say, Praveen, let's I'm going to be in Singapore. Let's, meet up, and are you free to catch up next Wednesday? What is the process that kicks in there, where Evie gets involved?
Right. So I typically get an email from you saying as much, and then at that point, I just copy Evie into that email and say, Graham, sounds great. Let's catch up next Wednesday. Evie is on copy, and she's going to help find us a time. And from that point onward, she steps in and she takes over the entire interaction with you. So she'll reach out and, based on my schedule and preferences, propose some time slots for you. And then from there, she'd go back and forth with you until the two of you can come to an agreement. I'm taken out of the loop, so I don't have to deal with those emails. And, even if you don't respond or you're slow to respond, Evie will be sort of diligent about following up with you. So it frees up a lot of mind space for me. For me, it's what we call fire and forget scheduling. I just send an email with Evie on it, and then I don't have to think about it again until it shows up on my calendar. Right.
So I guess it's a lot of pattern recognition going on here. They're looking at typical kind of responses. Is Evie preempting certain responses, and then, okay, that kind of matches that response, which says, okay, because, if Evie comes back to me and says, how about this time? And I say, this time or maybe an hour later, there's so many permutations, isn't there, of what could possibly come back to Evie.
Yep.
And getting it right is kind of important, because if she books in, if she just sees 12:30 when I said 12:30, but I'd prefer 1:30, do you see what I mean? If actually she books in 12:30 but wanted 1:30, it could go wrong. How do you account for all that? I mean, that must be crazy, trying to preempt all the different kind of, different responses a person could come back with.
Yeah, so actually this is probably a good place to talk about why we started with scheduling, right? From a technology standpoint, we started with scheduling because it was a good way to teach an assistant like Evie about people and how we talk about concepts like time and space. And you're absolutely right. The way we talk about these things, there's so many different permutations. And she needs to be able to understand, have an expectation of the range of responses that could possibly come through to any questions that she's asked. So one variation is, let's meet for lunch next week. And then you respond going, okay, Wednesday 12-1, got to run by 1:15. Mm-hmm. At that point, she needs to be able to understand that you've actually said yes to lunch on Wednesday, and that but your window is 12-1, and maximum you've got to run by 1:15, right? So that's why we started building Evie with the task of scheduling before we move on to do other stuff, because she really needs to understand how we talk about these concepts.
Mm. So for example, if I don't want to get too deep into the programming, because obviously that's a whole new world as well. But if I was to come back and just say something like, that would be cool, here's the challenge, because as human beings, when we look at the word that, we understand that is a concept referred to already in the conversation, right? So we have a nuance, which is this sort of, there's a meta conversation going on as well, where, we remember the context. And so when I say that, I remember that's the suggestion you just talked about. Is Evie good at picking up on those nuances? I mean, how have you found that? Because that's a real challenge with processing language.
Yeah, and that's why with something like Evie, and it's how we differentiate Evie from just regular chatbots, it's going beyond a syntactic understanding of language to building a semantic understanding, taking into account things like context, for example, right? In order to be able to make a decision as to what someone is talking about. And that really is the hard problem, and that's why it takes a while to build something like Evie. You're basically teaching a thing that has no conception of our world and how we operate in it, to sort of take in all the variations in which we talk about things and understand and run with it. And that's why you also kind of start with something quite so narrow as scheduling, right? Because then you limit the context, right? If you start with a chatbot assistant that really does anything and everything for you, it becomes a bit of a challenge, and it becomes a bit of a disillusionment for the end user as well. So if you think about some of the more prominent and early assistants in the space, where you were invited to ask anything and everything of that assistant, and when the response typically comes back, I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you mean, after a while, people stop trying. So we've sought to limit our domain to that of scheduling and try to create value for people within there, and at the same time build the capabilities of the system as we go, so that over time we're doing more than just scheduling for them.
Yeah, this comes back to that conversation about where you started out with Memetic, isn't it? That you had this bigger idea, and I want to go there and find out a little bit more about that, because that's really fascinating. Before we do, just talking about Evie a little, just so we can understand. Obviously, you've mentioned chatbots already, which I imagine, I don't know the architecture in chatbots, so I imagine it's pretty much hardwired, isn't it? It's like, okay, here's the decision tree, and they're going to go down this decision tree. Do you want to speak to A, B, or C? Do you want to do A, B, or C? But with Evie, even though it's quite a narrow band context where you're talking about the calendar, scheduling, right? There are a lot of different responses that you could get. So to what extent is Evie hardwired, and what extent is she, learning on the job?
Yeah. So I don't know how much of Jin's secret sauce I'm allowed to reveal, so I don't want to get into trouble there. But I think our approach is kind of a hybrid approach, right? We use a combination of traditional rules-based systems and machine learning in the natural language side of things. So for us to teach Evie what lunch is, we wouldn't need like 200,000 neatly annotated examples of lunch.
Right.
That would just be a rule that we've set up. If somebody says lunch, they mean between the hours of 12 and 2. Whereas the natural language, the machine learning bit really comes into teaching Evie variations in responses, right? So that's cool is the same as saying, okay, I agree, I'm happy to do it at that time. All of these responses essentially map to that's cool.
And what if they were to come back and throw in something random like, okay, by the way, I'm vegan?
So we've also learned that it's important how you fail, right? If you don't understand something, you shouldn't pretend to understand it and take action.
Right.
So in a situation where Evie doesn't understand a response, what she does is she reverts to the organizer and says, hey, I've just received this note from Graham. Don't quite understand what Graham means. Could I trouble you to respond?
Got it. Excellent. Well, that makes complete sense, doesn't it? I guess in the traditional chatbot sense, it would come back and say, oh, that's interesting. Tell me more about being vegan. That kind of, which is just kind of, it's a holding pattern really, isn't it? To bluff their way through it.
Yeah, and I think what we've seen from the way chatbots are built, if they were to do something like scheduling, I'd probably tell the bot, find Graham and I a time to meet.
Yeah. And
then the bot will come back and say, okay, when? Then I'd say next week. What day? Wednesday. What time? Between 12. At that point, I might as well just do it on my own.
Yeah.
Whereas with Evie, it's just find Graham and I a time to meet.
Yeah.
Right? And then off she goes.
Excellent. So I'm really fascinated about this bigger idea that you have. This is going back to mimetic. And to put this into context from my background with AI, when I was studying AI in the 90s, the big thing then was evolutionary robotics, which was basically, in simple terms, like building cockroaches. So building bugs that could explore a lab, they're all done in labs, and, seek out food or light or scurry away. And if somebody walked into the room, it would scurry away from the sound. And it would learn that if it had this kind of behavior and it failed, then, like in the natural world, it would eventually die. So the next generation would have what they called genetic algorithms back then. So a set of
where did you go to school?
Sussex University in but this was 1994 when AI was like guys in beards and sandals, and people thought, why the hell do you ever want to study that? And it was a laughable thing back then because it was cockroaches and frogs but again, the point was that people were the goal was that they said, well, if we can mimic a cockroach, the next, to get to the next step, which is a rat, is not a big step, right? We're kind of getting, and then, from a rat, we could go to some other kind of bigger mammal, and, eventually we'll get to human beings. That was the big goal of the whole thing. So there's lots of people studying all these kind of very confined context projects, which was really fascinating. But in their own, people said, well, why? Why am I going to fund somebody building a cockroach? And that was why AI and robotics back then never really kind of made sense to the outside world. So I'm fascinated now that you said, when you said off tape that there was, you had this bigger idea, and especially now that you said with mimetic. I'm really fascinated because you said just now that you have gone into scheduling because there's this really confined context. You can't go off and then talk about, how was your vacation, Praveen, that type of thing, right? It's not going to get involved in that yet. But you have this bigger idea. So let's talk about that. Did you go into this with the bigger idea first, or did you go into this and say, hey, look, we've got a scheduling assistant. Let's see what else we can do with it?
So the genesis of Evie really, I think this was back in 2013 when Jin and I had first, early 2013 when Jin and I had first met while we were at Yahoo, and we were working on this project together, and he was the project leader leading this new product that Yahoo was building at that time, and the project teams were scattered across 5 different cities: Sunnyvale, New York, Bangalore, Taiwan, and Singapore. So getting people together just for whip meetings was a bit of a nightmare. You spending too much time on it. So that was kind of where we started the conversation, and we very quickly went from there to hey, but I'm not just spending all of my time trying to corral people at the same time and place to meet, but also a lot of my time is being bled away with administrative tasks that are not core to my function, things like filing expenses, updating CRMs, booking my own travel. It was taking up anywhere between 40 and 60% of our time, and our work day just kept getting longer and longer as a result, but we weren't getting anything more productive. So him having a background in this sort of thing said, well, you know what, actually technologies at that point now where we can think about building these assistants that would work exactly like human beings. And I sort of took his word for it. And we talked about it. I know we talked about it for upwards of 6 months until one day he finally came to me and said, right, I'm speaking to my boss tonight. I've decided I'm going to quit and I'm going to go build this. And he said, are you in? And I said, no. Good luck with that. But actually.
So wait, back up a bit. He was in Yahoo at the time, or he was leaving Yahoo, and he asked you if you were in?
Yeah, he'd come to me one day and said, look, I've decided, we've been talking about this for a really long time. I'm leaving Yahoo. I'm going to go out and start building this. Would you want to join me?
You said
and
no.
I wasn't ready at that point, right? It was just kind of kicking off my corporate career. So I said no, but having felt some responsibility for talking him off the cliff, walking him off the cliff at that point, I said, well, here's a small contribution to the cause, all the best. And then he was really good about keeping in touch over the course of the next 2.5, 3 years, keeping us updated on what progress was. And then summer 2015, him and I got talking again. And personally, I was at that point where I was ready to try something new. And we'd had an MVP of Evie coming up at that point. So it was really a very happy concatenation of circumstances. I left. I was at Disney at that point. I left, joined Jin. We launched the product in beta, I think at the end of 2015, kicked off fundraising and, started building a company. And here we are. It's coming up on 2 years for me now. He's been at this for about 3.5, going 4 years. So it's been a very interesting ride for us.
Yeah, and that alone is a story well worth digging into. That leaving the corporate world, and you had worked for some, major brand names in media, which we'll talk about in a minute: CNBC, Yahoo, and the Disney Maker Studios as well, and then becoming an entrepreneur in your own right. So that's fascinating. I'm curious about the bit you're talking about, the fundraising. When you started out, you got funded by Seed Plus, based in Singapore, right? And we had Michael on the show not too long ago. Correct?
Smithy, you mean?
Yeah, Michael Smith. So we had him on the show, which was great. So when you went and pitched a product like this, and I'm sure you didn't just talk to these guys, you had practiced with many other people as well, did you find that, like those conference interactions when people walk up to you and, Evie, right, you're the Evie guys, right? What was the real click with people here? Was it that they actually use this thing now and they completely got it? Or was it the big picture idea about what this could be? Or what? What did you find that people really got about Evie when you were sitting the other side of the table asking for money?
Yeah, so I think even as early as 3.5 years ago when Jin started doing this, it was very hard to raise money for something like this, especially in this part of the world, because nobody would write a check for so speculative a project as this. It's hard to explain to them why scheduling was an important problem that needed to be solved or could even be solved, right? So in the early years, we were bootstrapped and we were government grant funded. So that's kind of what kept us alive and kept allowing Jin to keep building this for the first 2.5 years, as it were. And then when I came on board and we actively started fundraising, again, you'd get a range of responses, right? I've certainly been laughed out of many rooms about what we were doing.
Tell us about that, because that's an important part of your journey, right? That you can't gloss over, being laughed out of a room, because where you are now is important, right? Because you didn't give up. So tell us about those stories. We want to hear them.
Yeah, I remember the first week when I joined Jin, and I know back to back over the course of 2 days, we had meetings with a couple of ex-entrepreneurs who had a background in AI and who'd spent their graduate school years in some very prominent labs in the US. And they looked at us and they said, like, why are you doing this? I mean, we've tried this before and it all came to nothing. You know, is this the best use of your time? And, it was my first week on the job and I was like, oh my God, what have I done? Right. I've just quit a very comfortable job to come and do this. And here we have these guys who are ostensibly experts in the field.
Exactly. That must have raised a bit of doubt in you, right? Because you're not an AI guy. And when you've got these AI guys telling you that.
Right. So, but I placed a lot of trust in Jin.
Yeah.
I trusted that he knew what he was doing. And he sort of explained it. He's very good at breaking things down. And he kind of explained it to me and it made sense. And we're still here today. And, what we're doing today is making a lot more sense to people. It's easier to get meetings now. So, I think it's going well.
Fantastic. So, okay, well, you did get funding. You have grown, and you're developing the product. Do you see, Evie being the start of something else bigger, in the sense that, like you said, scheduling is a great way to learn, like within a confined set of rules? But, where would that go from there? What would be a natural extension? Only share what you're allowed to share, obviously, and what you want to share publicly, but give us a more generic picture of where that could go.
Yeah. So the starting point for us is, our problem statement is that we're spending too much of our time on things that are non-core to what we do. And we're being inundated by tasks. And that's kind of leading to a modern version of, I guess, alienation of labor. You're doing all these things and you can't really connect with your work anymore. Whereas we, I think as human beings, derive satisfaction from being able to exercise our creative faculties, right? So what we're doing with Evie is we want to build an assistant that can go on, run off and do these non-core administrative tasks autonomously. And that should leave you time and space to take a step back and really ask yourself, how best do I employ my talents and my energies? So we started with scheduling. And if you think about it, in a corporate environment, if you have control of a person's calendar, that tends to be the focal point of their activities. Everything they do gets planned around their calendar. So beyond just scheduling meetings, there are other ways in which we can be helpful. And it's not it's not hard to extrapolate from here where we go next, right? It's things like, travel and accommodation, helping you resolve your expenses, which used to be half-day activities for us back in the day when we finally get around to filing our expenses after multiple threatening emails from finance.
Yes.
Saying if you don't file now, we're not going to pay you. So that in theory should save you more time, give you more mind space to really become more effective at what you do.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a very interesting space. I've used for some time now, and it's not an AI bot in any way, but I've used Zapier for a number of months now, which is basically a service which you can plug into Gmail, or you can plug into Google Spreadsheets, or anything really, just anything with an API. And what it will do is if this input happens, I can do this output for you. Right. And a classic case would be if you put something in Dropbox in this file, an MP4 file, which is a video file, I'll upload it to YouTube for you using this set of tags and this information that you've put in Evernote. Right. Mm-hmm. That's not an AI scheduling assistant or an assistant in any way. But, what's interesting about that is what I've learned. And I think this is something that you're doing as well, is it's not really about time. You're not saving time at the end of the day. What's really interesting, especially for people like us, Praveen, is it's saving decisions, right? And, I read a really interesting story about Barack Obama, and when he was in office, every day he wore one of two suits. It was like a dark blue suit or it's like a charcoal grey suit. And every morning he had the same thing for breakfast. He had like 2 boiled eggs and a side of toast every day, or granola. And when asked why he did that, he said, look, I'm the president of the United States. The last thing I want to be doing is wasting my decision energy on what I'm going to have for breakfast, right? Because he needs to be making a decision about, do I press the button on North Korea or, whatever. So it's interesting that I find the space that you're in is more now we're realizing it, because we started out thinking it's about time, but what we're realizing is this whole thing about decision fatigue. It's like an energy. If you work in an environment where you're constantly making decisions, by midday you've run out. But if you can use Evie, you can kind of free that up and relieve some of the decision energy for you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You wake up every morning with a finite amount of energy and willpower, and every decision, every action that you take kind of drains from that pool. So in our world, for example, if your energies are constantly being drained by non-core administrative tasks, by the time you actually sit down to do the work that you're meant to do and you're meant to be creative at it, you probably don't have the level of energy and bandwidth required to be any good at it, right? So you're absolutely right. We're taking away having to think about things, having to remember things, and having to make decisions about low order tasks. You're automating all of that so that you're saving your mental bandwidth for things that are really important and really the things that only you can and should be doing as a function of who you are, your education, your experiences, your expertise. The machines can't do any of that.
Yeah, that's a really important point. There's a lot of fear at the moment about AI, isn't it, and machines, that they're going to take away everything and we're just going to be automated. But like you said, we automate the stuff that we shouldn't be doing anyway. The heavy lifting in our lives is done by these assistants, right? Leaving us to focus on the really important stuff like relationships and, well, the stuff that, you from your background, the front end stuff like talking to people, you can never, replace a face-to-face meeting. And that's really interesting. Your assistant isn't replacing that. I know some people want to come and meet Evie, which is kind of like an interesting byproduct. But ultimately, you're facilitating the stuff that can't be automated, right? You're automating that human interaction, which is really interesting because that's the stuff that machines can never do. But to do the heavy lifting, it enables more of that to happen. So I'm really curious to know where that would go, what the future opportunities are. But that's really speculation. You're in the space to know better than everybody else, but that's a sort of a future story that you can share here. So I want to change gears a little bit here and just go back to that whole thing about leaving your, I guess, if I can use the word, comfortable, safe life in media, in corporate world, and then becoming an entrepreneur. And, what that was like for you, because Jin left before you. Yeah. And he sort of got things going, and then you came later on, and you had this experience the first few meetings that you had, obviously you got a bit of a knockback on Evie and your project, or Mimetic at the time. So it wasn't like you were suddenly walking into a business where you had everything laid out for you, right? You had lots of subscriber customers, you had, everybody knew what you were, and, it was just now a growth story. How was that for you, leaving, CNBC, Yahoo, Disney, to go and start what would it have been, a two-man startup back then? Just describe those early days for us.
Yeah, so I think we were always very clear-eyed about our mission and the problem that we were setting out to solve. Now, and the way I often describe this is, going up to people, at least in those days, and telling them about Evie was pretty much walking up to somebody in 1979 with a prototype of a handphone, a mobile phone, which used to be very large and chunky at that point, right? And then people would go, well, why do I need to be lugging this thing around, right? I don't need to call anybody urgently. Nobody needs to call me urgently. Their phone's at home and in the office and stuff like that. So, and with meetings and scheduling and stuff like that, people have sort of internalized this norm where they've just become accustomed to doing these things themselves, right? So the early people that we talked to were like, well, I schedule my own meetings and it doesn't seem to be that much of a thing. But really, we knew that if we could get them to experience a different way of doing things, they wouldn't go back, right? Having said that, those early days when I joined up, it was just Jin and our first engineer. It was just two of them, itinerant coders, going from one coffee shop to another over the course of 2.5 years, is where they were working out of. And then when I joined, Jin was still heavily involved in, at that point, I think he was basically still writing the bulk of the code, and then we were running around trying to fundraise, thereafter trying to hire. So on the one hand, yes, you're right, it was a little bit uncomfortable to what I was accustomed to, but on the other hand, I think we were very clear-eyed, and we still are very clear-eyed about what it is that we wanted to achieve in the world with Evie, and that mission is what keeps us going. So I think we feel very good that we're solving a problem that needs solving. It looks on the surface, it looks trivial, it looks meetings, but actually when you sit down and you crunch the numbers, it's a non-trivial problem, right? People take anywhere from, actually the average Evie user takes about 5 meetings a day. And our internal data tells us it takes about 4.4 emails just to get these meetings set up. You go back and forth, there are reschedules and stuff like that. Even if you spend, let's say, 5 minutes with each of these emails, over the course of the year, it works out to be about 8 working days per person that you spend on something so trivial as email, as scheduling. And then if you multiply that time spent across large organizations, and all of a sudden, it's a big problem. It's a big productivity sink.
Yeah, I think people don't realize it as well. My old boss, Praveen, used to say to me, look, do you want to... he used to say something like, you can increase your productivity 20%. And you say, well, how can I do that? And he says, well, clear your desk. And you don't realize just something as simple as that, how that affects your productivity and mind space, because the stuff sitting on your desk, it's constantly there reminding you it needs to be done. It's like
it's clutter, right?
Yeah,
on your
right.
desk, in your inbox.
Exactly.
What to have for breakfast, what to wear. These are all the things that clutter your mind and keep you from moving quickly.
Let's talk about those Evie users, because I think they're a really important part of your story. I want to know a bit more about them and how they've been part of that journey with you. You've already given us some great examples, like people coming to the office wanting to meet Evie, which is great. I mean, people, I guess they don't feel duped, but when they find out, I think it must be a positive thing, right? It's like, oh wow, that's really cool, rather than, oh what, that was a bot? You get that positive response. People are open to that. So tell us a little bit about the kind of users and interactions that you've had and things that they've said to you that have shaped Evie and made you think, oh wow, I didn't think of it like that.
Yeah, so a product category like this, I think, if you look at the innovation diffusion curve, when we started out, it was really in the innovator space. So the types of people that we'd run into are really very early adopters of all kinds of technologies. And, they're very patient they understand that things like this are works in progress, and they were great evangelists. So we've been lucky in that our users have been the ones who've helped us spread EVE. They use EVE liberally and they talk about EVE and they tell everybody that they know about EVE, and they even go to the point of making people sign up on the spot. Right. So we've been very lucky to that what we're doing found the right group of people early on, and they've really helped us grow. I think where we are now, I think we're approaching that chasm. Now we're between early adopters and early majorities. Now you start having companies as well as large enterprises becoming cognizant of the problem, and they're looking for solutions to this problem, right? So they're looking across the market. There are a lot of future of work, future of meeting committees that we run into in large companies right now who are really looking for solutions to this problem of corporate time sinks. So we're at that point now where I think it's about to tip over and cross the chasm into mainstream adoption.
But that's where your experience in media comes in, and working for these companies like CNBC and Yahoo, because you know the language of those people, right? You can go and sell that, that solution to what their problem is. You need to be able to speak their language. That's the problem for a lot of entrepreneurs, isn't it? They don't really know how corporates work, and they're not sort of sensitive to what goes on behind that meeting, right? But you have that background, which I think is a really important add, because if you want to go into corporates, you've got it.
I think people are always amenable to a good story. And if you can, kind of tell your story in a compelling and succinct fashion, I think people are ready to come on board. There will always be people who are further down that adopter curve, and you'll get to them eventually. It's about identifying the right people and telling them in a compelling fashion why this is interesting and why this could be of value to them, and then really going from there. We're fairly confident that once we get Evie into people's hands, she kind of just goes from there. The product, she speaks for herself, right? At that point, we can take a step back and really she demonstrates her own value.
That's Praveen Velu, everybody, co-founder of Evie, Evie.AI. Praveen, before I let you go, you need to let us know where we can find out more about you. And also, I think people should go and try out Evie. So share with us some links, if you may, that we can go and check out your background and find out how this scheduling assistant works.
Right. So we are Evie.AI. That's Echo Victor India Echo.ai on the web. Go to the website. Please sign up. Try Evie. Give us feedback. We always love hearing from our users. I'm on LinkedIn, I guess. Praveen Velu. That's pretty much where I am mostly, because that's where our users tend to be as well.
We'll put all the details in the show notes. And Praveen, Evie, speaking to Evie, does that work? Just curious, because, you're going to get to a time where that's going to be more of a probability, right? Where you now have two Evies talking to each other. Does that all hang together nicely?
Well, the thing is, there's only really one Evie, right, on the back end. So when two Evie users try and schedule a meeting, there's no back and forth. She comes back immediately and goes, guys, based on your schedules, I've sent an invite for Thursday, 2 p.m., right? So it just makes the entire process, boils it down to a single email.
Fantastic. Praveen, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been really interesting. I feel that we only just scratched the surface. There's so much, not just in terms of what you're doing, but also where you're going. Because, like you said, this is really a starting point. And as you learn and master what you're doing with Evie in the scheduling side of things, you can add extra competencies on top of that. And that really then makes you relevant to a whole wide range of new people. And it's going to be really fascinating to see that growth story and where you're going with that. So please come back on Asia Tech Podcast Stories and share your story with us, because we want to see where that's going. I feel that this is going somewhere, and we want to, help share that story with people in our network as well. So, Praveen, thanks so much for coming and joining us on the show today.
Graham, thanks for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
You've been listening to Asia Tech Podcast. Find out more at www.asiatechpodcast.com.